The desert sun had a way of burning everything bare, stripping men down to their truths and women down to their secrets. Dust rolled across the cattle pens, stirred up by the restless hooves of horses that knew something uneasy was happening. The air hung heavy, not just with the smell of leather, sweat, and earth, but with the tension of eyes watching a scene too raw to ignore. A man stood tall in his weathered hat and long coat, his shadow falling across the dirt. At his side was a little girl, her golden hair wild from the wind, her finger raised and trembling as she pointed toward the figure tied to the post. Her voice, soft but shaken, carried a question that seemed too heavy for her years. "Daddy, is she dying?" The figure bound in ropes was not some outlaw dragged in for justice, nor a thief caught in the wrong place. She was a woman, her dress torn and dusted with the grit of travel, her skin marked by the chains that had carried her here. Her head hung low, strands of dark hair veiling her face, and though her breath still rose in shallow rhythm, her silence pressed harder than any scream might have. Whoever she was, however she had come, it was clear that this land had not given her mercy. And now, standing before the eyes of a child, she seemed to hover between life and death, between a past that had destroyed her and a future that had yet to be written. The man's jaw tightened as he placed a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder. He had seen death before on battlefields, in saloons, along the trails where men turned on each other for land or cattle or pride. But this was different. This was not the death of a man who had chosen his fight. This was the shadow of cruelty that had dragged a woman into the dust with nothing but shame for company. His daughter's question pierced him deeper than a bullet ever had. He did not want her to grow up believing the world was only a place of pain and endings. And yet what answer could he give when he himself was not certain whether the stranger before them had strength enough to go on? The horses shifted restlessly in the corral, their ears flicking at the sound of ropes tightening as the woman stirred. For the briefest moment, her head lifted and her eyes hollowed, searching. Yet not entirely gone met the child's. There was no plea in them, no begging for pity. Only a quiet question, unspoken, but clear. Was she still seen as human? The little girl's lips parted as if she might answer, but her father's hand gently pressed her back, keeping her close to his side. The man's heart was a hard one, forged by years of loss, but something about those eyes, about the way they clung to a thread of life, stirred in him a duty he could not turn from. The settlement was no stranger to outcasts. Men rode in with scars and left with deeper ones. Women came with nothing but the clothes on their backs and often disappeared without even that. But never before had someone arrived in chains, carried not by her own choice, but by the cruelty of another. Whispers had already spread among the townsfolk. Some said she had been caught running from a past too dangerous to name. Others claimed she was cursed, that no good could come from harboring a soul so marked by trouble. The man ignored them. He had long learned that the world was quick to speak against the broken, but slow to help them stand. The little girl tugged at his coat again. Her blue eyes, wide and questioning, did not look away from the woman tied to the post. She asked once more, softer this time, almost as if afraid of the answer. "Daddy, is she dying?" The man let out a slow breath, the kind that carried years of weariness, and crouched down beside his daughter. He whispered words only she could hear, words meant to steady her heart, though his own was far from steady. Then he rose, his boots sinking into the dirt, and stepped toward the bound stranger. The closer he came, the clearer the marks of her suffering became. Her wrists bore angry red burns where the chains had rubbed raw. Her ankles, bruised and swollen, told of miles walked under the weight of shackles. Yet, even in such ruin, there was a spark left in her. It was faint, like an ember hiding in ash, but it was there. And he knew, though he had not planned for it, though it would change everything, that he could not let that spark be smothered. He drew his knife, its blade catching a glint of the lowering sun, and paused. Around them, the corral fell silent, the horses still, the child holding her breath. With a single motion, he cut through the first rope. The sound of it snapping was sharp, almost like thunder, and for a moment it felt as though the entire land was listening. He did not yet know her name, nor her story, nor what storms she might bring into his life. But he knew this. he would not let her die tied to a post. Nameless and forgotten. As the ropes began to fall away, the woman swayed, her body too weak to stand. Her voice barely more than a whisper. He caught her before she fell, his arms strong but careful, like a man holding something fragile, something worth saving. His daughter watched, her small hand clutching the fence rail, her eyes filled with both fear and wonder. The man turned his head slightly, just enough to speak to her without letting go of the broken figure he now held. "Not today," he said, his voice low, almost a vow. "She's not dying today yet." Even as he said it, he knew this was only the beginning. A woman who came in chains carried more than wounds on her skin. She carried secrets, dangers, and enemies who might yet come looking. By cutting those ropes, he had tied himself to a fate he could not fully see. The dust of the West had a way of swallowing men whole, and now, perhaps, it would test if he could protect not only his daughter, but the stranger who had stumbled into their lives. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in streaks of gold and fire. Shadows stretched across the land as the man lifted the woman gently, his decision made though the cost unknown. The child followed close, still silent, her mind full of questions that would not rest. And behind them, the corral stood quiet, holding the echo of a moment that would change their lives forever. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, as if warning of the storms yet to come. And though the man carried her inside, giving her a dress, a name, and perhaps even a second life, one truth clung heavy in the air: the West was not done with them. Not yet would she find peace in this new beginning. Or would the change she had come in follow her still? The answer hung like the night sky above, vast, dark, and filled with uncertain stars. The house stood at the edge of the settlement, built from thick timbers that had weathered years of wind and rain. Its roof creaked in the evening air, and its windows caught the last glow of the sun before the night set in. Inside, the rooms were plain but warm, each marked by the quiet hand of a man who had built a home with his own sweat and labor. The girl moved quickly, pulling a chair close to the hearth, her small hands gathering kindling as though she understood more than her years should allow. She watched her father carry the woman across the threshold, the weight of the stranger's body pressing down like a secret neither of them yet understood. He laid her gently on a bed tucked against the far wall, a quilt folded across it. The fabric was worn from many winters, but it was clean and soft. The woman stirred faintly, her lips parting as though words might rise, but only a breath escaped. Her eyes fluttered, then closed again, surrendering to exhaustion. He set aside the chains that had clung to her wrists, coiling them on the floor like snakes no longer alive, but still dangerous to touch. His jaw tightened as he looked at them. Whoever had carried her in such a way had not meant her to find freedom. The girl crept closer, her bare feet making little sound against the wooden floor. She peered at the woman, tilting her head with curiosity and a touch of fear. She whispered to her father, asking where the stranger had come from, why she had been bound, and whether she would wake. He did not answer at first, only rubbed a hand across his tired face. He had no answers to give her, not yet. All he knew was what he had seen in the woman's eyes, that faint glimmer that had told him she wanted to live. He pulled a chair near the bed and sat, his weathered hands folded together. His mind went back to the trail where he had first seen her, half-dragged, half-carried by men who spoke with hard voices and eyes that cared nothing for mercy. He had not known their names, nor cared to ask. But he remembered the way they had looked at her as if she were nothing more than cargo. When he had stepped forward, placing himself between them and the settlement, there had been a standoff of silence. They had left without blood being shed, but their threats had hung heavy in the dust. He knew they would not forget. The girl climbed onto his lap, her small body curling into the safety of his arms. She whispered again, asking if the woman would stay. He glanced at the bed, at the faint rise and fall of the stranger's chest, and answered softly that for now she would. The girl pressed her cheek against him, but her eyes never left the figure lying in the shadows. In her young heart, questions grew up, questions of good and evil, of what it meant to save someone, and of whether the past could ever truly be left behind. Night settled thick across the land, bringing with it the sounds of coyotes on the ridges and the low hum of crickets. Inside, The fire crackled, throwing light across the walls. The man leaned back in his chair, his rifle propped within reach, his thoughts turning over like stones in a restless river. He knew he had stepped into something larger than himself. A woman in chains did not simply vanish from memory. Someone would come looking. And when they did, the quiet life he had built here for his daughter would be tested. The stranger stirred again, her breath catching as though she fought against unseen hands. Her eyes opened briefly, and in the flicker of the firelight, he saw not just fear, but a kind of strength that refused to break. She tried to speak, but her voice was dry, no more than a rasp. He brought her a tin cup of water, holding it steady as she sipped. The girl, watching from the edge of the chair, whispered encouragement, her voice gentle and clear. For the first time, a hint of something like relief softened the woman's expression, though it lasted only a heartbeat before the weight of exhaustion pulled her under again. In the days that followed, settlements stirred with curiosity. Men in white hats stood near the saloon, murmuring over mugs of bitter coffee. Women fetching water from the well spoke in lowered voices, their eyes glancing toward the house at the edge of town. No one asked directly, but all knew something had shifted. The West was a land that thrived on rumor, and whispers traveled faster than any horse. The man paid little attention, but he noticed the way eyes lingered longer than usual when he passed, and the way silence followed him where once there had been casual greetings at home. The girl grew attached to the stranger, hovering by her bedside, bringing her small treasures, wildflowers plucked from the edge of the trail, a smooth stone from the creek, a ribbon she had once worn in her hair. The woman accepted them with quiet gratitude, her voice still weak, but her eyes growing steadier each day. She spoke little of her past, offering no name, no story of where she had come from. Yet in her silence there was weight, as though words held dangers she could not risk. The man did not press her. He understood that some scars were not ready to be spoken of. Still, he watched closely, noting the way she startled at sudden noises, the way her eyes scanned the horizon before resting, the way her hands trembled when the chains she had been freed from caught her gaze. He knew she carried shadows inside her, and that those shadows were not yet gone. One evening, as the sun sank low, painting the sky in deep hues of red and gold, the man stood by the fence of the corral, his daughter beside him. She asked once more if the woman would stay, her young voice holding hope like a fragile flame. He looked toward the house, where the stranger sat near the window, her face half hidden in the dim light. He answered slowly, telling her that sometimes people needed time to find out where they belonged. The girl nodded, though she did not fully understand that night. Long after his daughter had fallen asleep, the man remained awake. He stood by the window, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. The land stretched endlessly, but he felt its weight pressing close. Somewhere out there, he knew, were the men who had brought the woman here, and they would not stay away forever. He thought of the chains lying coiled in the corner of his home, and of the quiet strength in the woman's eyes. He knew the day would come when the past would arrive on his doorstep, and when it did, he would have to decide what price he was willing to pay to protect not only his daughter, but the stranger who had come into their lives with nothing but pain. The wind rose that night, rattling the windows and carrying with it the howl of wolves from the far hills. The fire burned low, shadows deepening in every corner. The woman stirred in her sleep, her breath uneven, her hand clutching the quilt, as though fighting ghosts no one else could see. The man moved closer, his hand resting lightly on the rifle at his side. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, but he knew one truth: the West was a place where a man's choices carved his fate as sharp as a knife's edge. And his choice had already been made the moment he cut through those ropes. The stranger was no longer a prisoner in chains. But freedom in this land came with its own battles. She had been given a bed, a dress, and perhaps even the beginning of a new name. Yet the question lingered in the dark, as steady and relentless as the ticking of time itself. Would she ever truly be free, or had the chains only shifted? From iron around her wrists to the burden of secrets that might yet destroy them all, the night wore on. And the man kept watch, the firelight flickering across his face. Outside, the world waited, silent and merciless. Inside, beneath the roof of his hard-earned home, fragile hope began to stir, but hope in the West was as dangerous as any enemy. The story was only beginning, and the shadows had not yet lifted. The days stretched into weeks, though time in the West had a way of moving differently. Some mornings felt endless, the sky wide and unforgiving, while other nights passed like a shadow slipping across the land. The woman who had come in chains grew stronger, but her silence held steady, guarding the truth of her past as if it were more dangerous than the men who had brought her there. The man noticed every change, how her steps grew firmer, how her hands, once too weak to hold even a cup, now carried water from the well. Yet he also noticed how her gaze often lingered on the horizon, as if waiting for something to come out of it. The settlement carried its own rhythm. Wagons rolled through with supplies, cattle were driven across the fields, the church bell rang on Sundays, its sound reaching even the quiet edges where the man's home stood. Folks had grown restless with curiosity, and whispers circled like buzzards over carrion. Some said the woman was a runaway, others that she had been caught in a crime so grave her captors had no choice but to bind her. None of the talk carried truth, but in a town where rumor fed more than bread, the danger lay not only in the men who might return for her, but in the people who already lived nearby. The little girl seemed untouched by such talk. To her, the stranger was no longer a mystery in ropes, but someone to follow with wide-eyed devotion. She spent her mornings dragging her toys across the floor to share, her afternoons showing the woman the corners of their small land. She spoke to her as if she were family already, filling silence with laughter, questions, and stories of the simplest things, like the shape of clouds or the sound of the creek at dusk. The woman listened, sometimes smiling faintly, though the smile never reached her eyes. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in strokes of copper, a rider came into town. He was not a man known to the locals, and his presence was felt before he spoke a word. His horse was dark, dust clinging to its sides, and his coat hung heavy with the wear of long travel. He rode slow through the street, eyes sharp, taking in every detail. Some men nodded politely, others turned away, sensing a trouble they did not want to stir. At the saloon, he dismounted, tying his horse with care. Inside, his voice carried low but firm, asking questions no one wished to answer aloud. The name of the man at the edge of town came up, and though none admitted knowledge, the rider left with more than he arrived with. The man, unaware, spent that same evening mending a fence. His daughter played nearby, her laughter chasing the chickens that scattered in the yard. The woman stood on the porch, her hair catching the last light of the day. She called softly for the girl to come closer, her voice carrying a note of urgency. When asked later, she claimed it was nothing more than a motherly instinct. But her eyes, fixed on the hills beyond, told another story. She had seen something, a shadow, perhaps, or the glint of movement where none should be. That night, sleep came uneasy. The man rose several times, stepping to the window, listening for sounds that did not belong. He thought of the chains coiled in the corner, of the men who had once dragged her across the land. He wondered if by freeing her he had chained his own home to a danger too great to bear. Yet when he looked toward the bed where his daughter slept, he knew he would not have chosen differently. The next morning brought new tension. At the well, two women whispered openly, their eyes flicking toward the stranger with thinly veiled suspicion. One muttered that the man had gone soft, risking his child for the sake of a nameless drifter. The other crossed herself, whispering of curses that followed such women. The words carried farther than intended, reaching the ears of the girl, who clutched her small bucket tighter, her lips pressed thin. She ran home, her cheeks red, and when she told her father, his jaw hardened. He had fought battles with men before, but the fight with gossip was one without clear victory. The woman heard of it too, though no one dared say it directly to her face. She retreated into silence again, her eyes often downcast, her shoulders carrying a weight invisible to others. The man tried to reassure her, speaking gently, telling her that the land had always been hard and that people feared what they did not understand. She nodded, but deep down he could see she believed none of it. She had lived too long under the eyes of others to expect mercy from them now. Meanwhile, the rider lingered. He stayed at the saloon, watching, waiting. When asked his business, He gave no clear answer, only saying he was tracking something that belonged to him. At night, his horse stood restless outside, as though it too carried the tension of a mission unfinished. The townsfolk grew wary, though none dared confront him. They simply watched, waiting for the storm they felt brewing. Back at the homestead, the girl began asking questions that cut deeper than she realized. She wanted to know why the woman never spoke of where she came from, why she woke from dreams with her fists clenched, why sometimes she looked at the road as though expecting someone to appear. The man answered carefully, reminding his daughter that not all stories were ready to be told. But inside, he shared the same questions, and each day they gnawed at him more. The woman herself struggled with a growing conflict. Gratitude pressed heavy on her gratitude for the roof, the bed, the child who saw her as something more than broken. Yet fear pressed heavier still. She knew the men she had fled would not forget, and she knew the chains she had worn were not the last she might face. In the quiet of the night, she sometimes touched the dress she had been given, her fingers tracing the fabric, as if reminding herself she was no longer bound. But freedom, she knew, was not yet hers. As autumn settled in, the land began to change. The air grew cooler, the nights longer. The man worked harder, preparing stores for the winter, but his eyes often strayed toward the horizon. He could feel it now, a pressure in the air, the way the ground felt before a storm. Trouble was coming, and it was coming soon. The rider in town was no mere traveler. He carried with him the scent of unfinished business, and the woman in his home was at the heart of it. One evening, when the sky was heavy with clouds, the rider finally made his move. He walked the road out of town, his boots leaving prints in the dust, his hand resting near the iron at his side. The townsfolk watched from their porches, none brave enough to interfere. They knew where he was headed, and they knew the silence that would follow his passing would be thicker than any storm. Inside the house at the edge of town, the girl sat by the hearth, humming softly as she played with her dolls. The woman watched her, though her gaze often drifted to the window, her breath uneven. The man sat sharpening his knife, the sound steady, his eyes fixed on the blade though his thoughts were far beyond it. He felt it before he saw it, the shift in the air, the way the dogs barked in the distance. The faint rhythm of footsteps coming closer. The woman's hand trembled slightly as she set her cup aside. She looked at him, her eyes heavy with something between fear and resolve. She whispered one word, barely audible, but enough to chill the air between them. "They have found me." The man rose slowly, his hand resting on the rifle by the door. His daughter looked up, sensing the change, her innocent smile fading into confusion. The woman's eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed older than the land itself. She had wanted to keep her silence, to shield them from the truth, but the truth was no longer hers to hold. The past had come knocking, and it would not wait outside. The rider's shadow stretched long across the dirt, his steps sure, his purpose clear. The West had a way of testing the choices of men, and tonight those choices would demand their reckoning. The homestead stood in silence, its walls holding the weight of 3 lives bound together by fate. And as the wind rose, carrying dust across the yard, the question hung heavier than ever before. Could one act of mercy change a life, or would it only bring ruin to everyone it touched? The answer was not yet here, but it was close, riding on the edge of the night, and it would not be denied. The night grew heavier as the rider's steps closed in. The crunch of his boots on gravel seemed louder than the cry of coyotes, louder than the rustle of dry grass in the wind. Inside the house, the fire had burned low, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls. The man stood near the door, his rifle steady in his hands, though his jaw was set not just in readiness, but in resolve. The woman leaned against the wall, her chest rising and falling unevenly. Her eyes locked on the door as though expecting it to splinter at any moment. The little girl clutched her doll, her gaze darting between her father and the stranger who had become part of their home. The man knew this moment had been coming, since the day he cut the ropes. The West never let a secret stay buried. Every choice brought its weight, and the choice he had made now stood at the threshold. The air inside the room carried the kind of silence that bends beneath tension, a silence where even breathing felt too loud. He motioned for his daughter to move back, guiding her gently behind the table, where shadows might hide her small frame. She obeyed, though her eyes never left him. Wide and full of questions she could not put into words. The knock, when it came, was not polite. It was sharp, demanding, echoing through the wooden boards, as if meant to split them in two. The man did not answer right away. Instead, he lifted his rifle slightly, his voice calm but firm as he called out, asking the stranger's business. A pause followed, the kind of pause that revealed more than words ever could. Then came the voice, low, rough, and certain. He said he was looking for what belonged to him. The woman's breath caught. She pressed a hand to her chest as if steadying her heart. She shook her head faintly, whispering that it was not just him outside. He was never alone. Where he went, others followed. The man narrowed his eyes, peering through a crack in the curtain. The rider stood there, hat low, hand near the iron at his hip. But his stance was too relaxed for someone who had come alone. The man's instincts told him the truth. More eyes were watching from the darkness. Hidden among the mesquite and rock, the little girl, sensing the weight of fear in the room, crept to her father's side and tugged at his coat. She whispered, asking if the man outside would take the woman away. Her voice was so soft it nearly broke him, but he did not answer. He only rested his hand briefly on her shoulder before guiding her back again. He could not let fear root itself in her heart. Not yet. Not while he still stood between danger and his home. Outside, the rider's voice rose again, this time colder. He said the woman was marked, that she had debts unpaid, that she had no right to the new life she now held. His words slithered like venom through the boards, carrying threats too heavy to ignore. The woman clenched her fists, her body trembling not from weakness, but from a fury she tried to hide. She whispered that his words were lies, that he twisted truth to chain her again. Yet her eyes, wide and unblinking, revealed she feared some part of what he said might hold weight in the minds of others. The man stepped closer to the door, his voice steady, telling the rider that no one here belonged to him, that the land itself was freer than the chains he spoke of. Another pause stretched out, this one longer, heavier. Then the sound of laughter, cruel and low, seeped through the wood. The rider said the West had no use for men who sheltered thieves, and no mercy for women who thought they could escape their past. The woman covered her face with her hands for a moment, then dropped them, her eyes fierce. She turned to the man, her voice breaking as she admitted there were things she had not told him, things too dangerous to speak. She had fled not just cruelty, but men tied to blood and coin. Men who would not stop until they dragged her back or left her broken in the dirt. She whispered that she should leave, that by staying she would bring ruin to his daughter, to his home, to everything he had built. The man shook his head slowly, his voice firm, saying he had seen enough to know she was no thief, no curse. He reminded her that when he cut her ropes, he had chosen a path, and there was no turning back from it now. The sound of hooves struck then, faint at first, then louder, circling. The man's grip on his rifle tightened. He knew now there were more outside, hidden in the dark, waiting for a moment of weakness. The rider had not come to talk. He had come to claim. The West was a place of showdowns, where words ended at the pull of a trigger. But the man also knew he was not facing this fight for pride or land. He was facing it for the life of a woman who had known too much pain, and for the child whose innocence still lit the darkest corners of his world. The little girl crawled closer again, her eyes brimming with tears, whispering the question she had asked once before. "Daddy, is she dying?" This time, the words struck deeper, because he did not know the answer. The woman knelt beside the child, her trembling hand brushing back the golden strands of hair. She said softly, her voice breaking, that dying was not the same as giving up, and that no matter what happened, she would not give up. The man felt a surge in his chest, a fire that rose higher than fear. He turned back to the door, calling out to the rider that no chain would hold in this house, that no man had the right to steal another's freedom. The silence that followed was sharp, as though the whole land held its breath. Then came the sound of boots shifting in the dirt, the click of iron, the creak of leather, as hands moved closer to weapons. Inside, every heartbeat seemed louder than the last. The woman gripped the table for balance, her eyes darting to the window, where shadows moved just out of sight. The girl pressed against her father's leg, her small frame trembling but her eyes steady, as if she knew this was a moment that would change everything. The man's voice dropped low as he told them both to stay back, no matter what they heard. He raised his rifle, stepping closer to the door, every sense sharpened by the danger pressing in. Outside, the wind carried the smell of dust and horses, the sound of men waiting for a signal. The rider spoke again, quieter now, almost calm, promising that if the woman stepped out willingly, no blood need be spilled. The words were smooth, but they carried the weight of falsehood. The man knew better. The moment she stepped outside, her life would not be hers any longer. The woman shook her head violently, whispering that she would not go back, that she would rather die free than live in chains again. Her voice cracked, but her eyes were fierce, burning with a strength that had been buried but never destroyed. The little girl clung tighter, whispering through tears that she did not want her to leave. Not ever. The rider shifted again, his shadow moving closer to the door. The men outside muttered, their voices carrying through the still night. The man inside steadied his breath, his finger brushing the trigger, his body taut as a drawn bow. The moment had come where words could no longer hold back what was about to break. Loose. The silence before the storm stretched unbearably, every second heavier than the last. The woman stood now, beside the man, her frame shaking but her chin lifted. The child pressed between them, her small presence a reminder of what was at stake. The fire burned low, its last embers glowing faintly, as if marking the moment before something greater ignited outside. A coyote howled from the ridge, its cries slicing through the night. And in that instant, the rider's voice rose one final time, sharp and commanding, giving the order that would shatter the fragile stillness. The man's grip tightened. The woman's breath caught. The girl's eyes widened, and the night exploded into motion. The night broke open with sound and fury. Hooves pounded, guns cracked, and voices shouted across the dark yard. The man pulled his daughter behind him, his rifle already leveled, as shadows moved against the flicker of firelight. The first shot whistled past the window, splintering wood into sharp fragments. He fired back, his aim steady, the echo rolling across the plains like thunder. The woman, though trembling, grabbed a lantern and held it high, casting light through the room. For the first time, her fear turned into defiance. She would not go quietly. She would not let the child see her broken again. The rider outside barked commands, his men circling the house like wolves. But the man knew his land, every fence post, every rock and hollow. He fired again, dropping one of the shadows that had crept too close. The little girl pressed her hands to her ears, her wide eyes fixed on her father, as if she could hold him safe by watching him. The woman knelt beside her, shielding her with her body when glass shattered from a bullet tearing through the window. The standoff dragged deep into the night, neither side willing to give. The men outside grew restless, muttering, their courage thinning with every shot answered from within. The rider himself stayed firm, though his voice grew harsher, his threats more desperate. He shouted the woman's name, a name she had hidden until now, promising her suffering if she did not surrender. At that, the little girl looked up in confusion, realizing for the first time that the woman had carried a past she had never spoken. But before questions could arise, another shot tore through the silence, and the moment passed into chaos again. It was only when dawn crept across the land, turning the horizon pale gold, that the fight began to falter. The rider, his men fewer now, called for retreat. Their silhouettes faded into the dust, hooves pounding farther and farther, until the land swallowed them. The man lowered his rifle slowly, his chest heaving with the weight of the long night. The woman leaned against the wall, her breath ragged, her eyes wide with disbelief. The girl clung to her father's leg, tears streaking her cheeks, her small body trembling but alive. Silence settled heavy in the wake of it all. The man stepped outside, scanning the land, his jaw set, his eyes wary. The yard bore scars, splintered wood, broken glass, trails of blood leading into the dust. Yet the house still stood, and within it, so did those he had fought for. He turned back to the doorway, his gaze falling on the woman who had come in chains but now stood, though shaken, as someone stronger. In the days that followed, the town buzzed with talk. Some spoke of the gunfire that had rung out, others of the strangers who had come and gone. Whispers of the woman's name spread, though none dared speak them to the man's face. He had proven himself in the defense of his home, and in the West, such proof carried more weight than rumor. Still, eyes lingered longer on her when she passed, questions unspoken but sharp as knives. The little girl, though shaken, grew braver in the aftermath. She clung less to her father's side and more to the woman's hand, as though the fire of that night had bound them together in a way nothing could undo. She asked fewer questions of death and more of life, what flowers bloomed in spring, what birds sang at dawn, how stories might be told so people remembered. The woman, though haunted, found comfort in answering those questions, her voice steadier now, her eyes brighter with each day that passed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of crimson, the woman sat with the man on the porch. The little girl played in the yard, her laughter chasing the chickens again, as though she had reclaimed something stolen. The woman finally spoke of her past, her words quiet, halting, but honest. She told of the men who had bound her, of the debts she had never owed but was forced to carry, of the chains that had dragged her across land and soul alike. She admitted she had run not only for freedom, but for survival, and that she had never expected to find kindness waiting in a stranger's hand. The man listened, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He did not speak much, only nodded at times, his silence carrying more weight than words. When she finished, he turned to her and said simply that the past had no place in chains here. Whatever had come before, what mattered now was the life before them. She looked at him then, tears in her eyes, but for the first time. Not from sorrow. The settlement slowly accepted what could not be changed. The rider never returned, and though the fear of his shadow lingered, the land grew quiet again. Seasons shifted, winter bringing snow across the plains, spring painting wildflowers along the creek. The woman worked beside the man, her hands steady in tasks, once foreign to her, mending fences, tending gardens, guiding the child through lessons. She grew into her place, not as a burden, but as someone whose presence shaped the home itself. The little girl, now older, often repeated the question she had once asked on that fateful day. But the tone had changed. No longer was it asked with fear, but with curiosity, as if testing the memory of what had passed. "Daddy, is she dying?" The man would smile faintly, shaking his head, telling her that dying was not what happened when chains were cut. Living was what happened after. And the woman, standing nearby, would smile softly too, her eyes meeting theirs with quiet strength. Time did not erase the scars, but it softened them. The chains that had once defined the woman's story were now tucked away, coiled in the corner of the barn, rusted and forgotten. The girl grew taller, her laughter filling the house with warmth. The man aged, his shoulders still broad, but his hair touched with gray, his heart steadied by the family he had not expected to find. And the woman, once nameless, found not only a name, but a life built from freedom, from kindness, from the promise of second chances. Years later, as the girl stood at the edge of the corral, now nearly grown, she looked back at the house and saw the two figures who had raised her standing side by side. She thought of the day when fear had almost stolen everything, and she whispered softly to herself the words her father had once said. Not today. Not ever. The West remained what it always had been, a land of hardship, of whispers, of storms. But within that house on the edge of town, something had been carved out against the dust and danger. A story of chains broken, of a dress given, of a name restored. A story where mercy had been stronger than cruelty, and where a man, a woman, and a child had learned that family was not always born, but sometimes made in the fiercest of trials. And, as the sun set once more, casting long shadows across the land, the world seemed to pause in quiet reflection. The chains were gone. The fear had passed. What remained was the simple truth that love and courage had the power to rewrite even the harshest story. The West would always test them, but together. They had already faced its hardest question. She had come in chains, but she had found freedom. She had been nameless, but now she was family. And in that truth, the story found its end, not in sorrow, but in the strength of a second life. Top of form, bottom of form.